Welcome to Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church in Bolivia. This is Season 3, the Aymara Revolution within the IEMB, and this is a bonus podcast on the early life of Felilpe Saucedo, who many of you know, and he is the father of Wilson Saucedo, and many North Americans know Wilson from their VIM trips to Bolivia. And Felipe was right in the middle of the Aymara Revolution and was one of its leaders. Let me tell you a little about the life story of this incredible man that I have come to know and become friends and have even been made to feel a part of his family, Pastor Felilpe Saucedo. In the 1930s, Felipe's parents, Zacarias Saucedo Mamani and his wife, Angelica Honorio Calle, moved from a remote indigenous village when a drought destroyed their crops. They found work in the mining area around Vuco. When they were young, Zacharias and Angelica both worked in these mines, which were at a remarkable altitude of over 18,000 feet. That's over 3 miles high. There was so little oxygen, it was hard to even keep a small fire burning. It was snow-packed and cold about 12 months a year, and there were no doctors, no teachers, and extremely dangerous work in the mines. Housing was improvised. The houses were made of stone with tin roofs. As you gained seniority, you would be offered the chance to move to a little bit nicer home. The workers' days lasted from 5 a.m. to 6 p.m. They would walk to the mine in their clothes, which was thick cloth, waterproof rubber bags, reinforced rubber boots, and a helmet with a lamp attached to it. They would be carrying their bag of coca leaves to chew to counteract the fatigue, the hunger, and the polluted air in the tunnels and the headaches from the altitude. As they entered into the mine, each miner would stop and make an offering to El Tío, translated as the uncle. Tío is a god demon who lives in the mine shafts, and miners gave the statue of Tío cigarettes, cacao, coca, and liquor. And in exchange, El Tío grants them safe passage within the mines. And if this ritual was ignored, it was believed that El Tío would cause some miners to die. At 6 p.m., the workers dragged themselves back to their makeshift homes, ate dinner, and collapsed in bed, resting to go to work the next day. They worked every day except Sunday. As we've already heard, in April of 1952, M&R won an election and established a government that ended the hacienda patron peon form of indentured servitude. In addition to that, in 1953, M&R nationalized the mines. This was a triumph for the working miner, as now a government-run mine would pay its workers more and provide better health and safety standards. Felilpe Saucedo was born as the second child of Zacharias and Angelica on April 11, 1947. His family consisted of his father, Zacharias, his mother, Angelica, his older sister, Severina, and his brother, Luis. Felipe tells about remembering how one day his father and all the miners of town were loaded into several dump trucks and rode to La Paz. They were there to defend the National Revolution from a threatened military takeover. The miners were armed with torn blankets and old Mauser rifles and their miners' helmets and dynamite. Days later, they returned with cheers and dynamite detonations, overflowing with satisfaction and joy to celebrate the triumph of the defense of the National Revolution of 1952. Years went by, and Felipe grew up as a typical child of a miner, valuing the family, the sacrificial work of his parents, participating in civic and festival days, and he entered primary school at a time when the philosophy of education included punishments for not memorizing facts, and harsh attention was brought upon any child who made any kind of mistake in the class or didn't comply with what they were told to do. Now, this was seen, of course, by the Criollo and Mestizo populations as essential education for young indigenous children. Be quiet, do what you're told, and severe punishment for any failure of lack of obedience. It was a lesson that was supposed to stay with them for a lifetime. That was how they were supposed to live their entire lives, accepting their fate as ones whose lives were controlled by others. In the mining center, there was also the celebration of worship or mass on Sundays and on special days. Parish priests came from the town of Kime to conduct services at the mine. It was a time for religious activities, praying, listening to biblical teachings, singing, and was often led by some nuns whom they called little mothers or madrecitas. At a very young age, Felipe was strongly attached to these services. He was an active participant and often gained special attention and appreciation from the madrecitas. After more than 40 years of work in the mine, Felipe's father decided to retire from the company and move the family to the town of Eucalyptus in 1956-57. Eucalyptus was a very busy town at the time, which included Hispanic, Mestizo, and indigenous town members. It is located off the main highway between Aurora and La Paz, not far from Canani. It was a growing town because it was a storage and transportation center for the minerals from the Vico and the Caracoles mines to be transported by railroad to the seaports of Chile. Felipe's father worked in construction, building homes for the growing population in Eucalyptus. Felipe and his siblings attended school at Eucalyptus. And since this was after the 1952 revolution, once Felipe completed his elementary schooling, he was allowed to begin high school. As a young teenager, Felipe also picked up some odd jobs. He was a spokesman for some collectives in the city of Oruro, and later was an apprentice to a tailor in Oruro. After that, Felipe started working in a bakery owned by the Marconi family. The Marconis treated Felipe especially kind ways with fair wages for his work. In fact, the Marconi family considered the workers as a part of their family. Felipe continued his spiritual growth through his early teenage years. He religiously attended Mass whenever it was available, and he became an altar boy at the local Catholic church and assisted in the Mass and took care of the altar for the church. Felipe said, quote, I made my act of confession and first communion after the rites of the occasion. I received communion, the host, for the first time. It was a very important day, which would leave a very special mark in my deepest feelings. I felt very attached to the religious activities of the village, especially observing the work of the priests and the women, the elderly, the youth, and the children of the village. I longed to see if one day I could become a priest. Well, in 1962, Felipe's mother got seriously ill with what they later found out was kidney disease. There were, of course, no medical doctors or medical care of any kind available in the town unless she rode a bus all day to get to La Paz, a trip she couldn't possibly survive. The religion of the campo was a weird mixture of Roman Catholic Christianity, native religions of Pachamama, and superstition. Felipe's father sought out all the traditional means of healing for his wife. He visited fortune tellers and healers and seers, etc., but none of them worked. He went to the priest, and the priest told him to celebrate a health mass in the oldest Catholic church in the region. They even asked Zacharias to find a statue of a saint or of the Virgin which the family owned that might be cracked or deteriorated that could be affecting their mother's health. Wow. Zacharias arrived at the family chapel in the community of Angelica's grandparents to pray for healing. But suddenly the rage built up inside of him, and in complete frustration, Zacharias took a stick and began to destroy all the statues of the saints in the small family church, defying further misfortune from God. And Angelica, over the coming months, simply got worse and worse and sicker every day. The following year, some Baptist missionaries arrived as visitors to the Baptist congregation in Eucalyptus. Felipe says that his father, upon hearing the news that the missionaries were helping people in need, immediately went to the missionaries to ask them to visit their sick mother. Later that day, the foreign and national Baptist missionaries arrived at the house, observed my mother, prayed for, and immediately asked if they could take her to the hospital in Oruro in a vehicle that they had. So the missionaries loaded Felipe's mother into the car and they headed to the city of Oruro to be hospitalized at the general hospital in the city. Angelica remained in the center for 3 months. But at the end of that time, she had completely recovered from her illness. This moment marked an important milestone in the family since Felipe's father decided to attend the Baptist church in town and to become a Protestant Christian. After a few weeks, they had the news that other missionaries were visiting Eucalyptus, especially the Betania or Bethany Methodist Church of Eucalyptus. Pastor Edward Barber and other missionaries were staying in the house of the Marconi family, who were Methodist members of the congregation. So Felipe's father sent the young 15-year-old Felipe to the missionary living in Eucalyptus to see if he could purchase a Bible. This seems a little strange since no one in the family could even speak Spanish except for Felipe. I'm not sure, but perhaps Felipe's father thought that the Bible would work like an amulet. Simply holding the Bible would bring healing. On a Sunday morning, Felipe went to the home of the missionary, Edward Barber. Pastor Barber was one of the post-1956 Land of Decision missionaries who moved out of the cities and into the larger towns with significant Hispanic and Mestizo populations. Felipe asked, quote, "Do you have a Bible to sell?" unquote. Pastor Barber said, "No, but I do have a small New Testament in both English and Spanish. However, I won't sell it to you. I want to give it to you, but there's just one condition. I want you to come to worship later today at the church." Pastor Barber handed Felipe a small booklet with dark leather cover and shiny edges that looked like gold. It was a fantastic book. And on the way home, Felipe noticed that it was a New Testament in both Spanish and English, with a handwritten inscription on the inside of the cover, which simply read, "Reverend Edward Barber." For the first time, we had in our hands the little book of the evangelist. After handing it to my father, I let him know the condition that I had committed to and get the booklet. Felipe said, "I felt like I owed him something. So that same day, I went back for worship. As a young boy, I was involved in the Catholic Church as an altar boy. I was even thinking about studying at the Catholic school. But when I walked into the little church that morning, I was deeply impressed, especially by how they welcomed new people. Men, women, young people all came up and hugged me and welcomed me with open arms. This was a really big deal for a 15-year-old boy. Felipe continues in his writing. It was a Sunday in July 1963, a day that would mark the course of my future. According to the commitment made, I arrived for the first time at the Betania Methodist Church, a work initiated in 1957 by lay pastors Norberto Impa and Francisco Balboa of the El Redentor Methodist Church in the city of La Paz. Entering, found myself at the back of the room, near the entrance, in a house belonging to the Martinez family, which was used as a chapel for the congregation. Approximately 30 to 40 people were in attendance, and that day they received the visit of missionaries Reverend Edward Barber and another missionary from the United States who were visiting Bolivia. During the worship service, hymns were sung and there were prayers and preaching, and the church was filled with neighbors and popular people and former miners and merchants and rural migrant families from surrounding communities. But what was most striking in the life of Betania Methodist Church was the sense and spirit of fellowship and brotherhood among the families belonging to the congregation. There was no discrimination based on age, race, gender, social class, or even belonging to another religion, such as the Catholic Church. Everyone was welcome. The time came to welcome the new visitors, and I still didn't understand the meaning of this moment until Don Daniel Marconi and his wife Dora Marconi, glancing at the audience, directed their gaze towards the place where I was located. They called my name. They asked me to come forward as well. I moved forward with much fear and trembling, because who was I to be in front of so many people in an unknown place? Then a hymn began, accompanied by clapping to the rhythm of the accordion music, which were words of welcome. Then all the members of the church proceeded to extend and squeeze the hands of the visitors, expressing words of welcome to each person and making an affectionate and expressive embrace that wrapped warmly and fraternally around the guests. When it was my turn to receive these gestures of greeting and appreciation, I felt something particular that I'd never experienced before, like a deep and inexplicable warmth and that invaded my body as I received a handshake and effusive hugs. In this moment, I felt for the first time that I was considered to be an important person, as I was greeted and embraced by older people, and they even spoke my name. The Marconis then took the floor to introduce me to the congregation and challenged me to attend and join the congregation. I returned home impressed and excited because for the first time I had been the object of so much appreciation in my adolescence. I shared at home the experiences I had and the fact that I had accepted the commitment to join the congregation. My mother and father, in this situation, consistent with their ethical principles and their commitments, decided that they would join the Baptist church in the town as a gesture of gratitude for the favors received from the healing of their mother. However, Philippe's parents later joined the Methodist church once Philippe became a pastor. As for Philippe's part, he writes, due to the experience of finding a welcoming community of Methodist believers, I decided to integrate myself from that day forward in a permanent way into the life of the Methodist Church. Reverend Beneficio Maciez, from the first days, has led me particularly active into the life of the congregation, wanted me to eventually assume some leadership on Sunday morning worship services, along with other young men and women in the church. At the beginning, I was afraid to assume these responsibilities, and I intentionally sat in the back row of the church. However, the pastors insisted in my participation in the activities and programs of the church, both in the Sunday school classes and with the children and the youth league. As time went on, I became an active element, and in the eyes of the leaders and those responsible for the congregation, I was shaping up for something more challenging and more promising in the future of the church. End of quote. Philippe continued to attend the Methodist church, and then one day, Pastor Barber asked Philippe if he could lead the songs during worship. Philippe did, and he could play the accordion. The congregation loved it. In 1965, Philippe joined a district evangelism team workshop, and he was impressed when he saw that the IEMB was starting a national movement to bring equality for the indigenous people, and began to feel God moving in his life, calling him into the ministry. Up until the 1960s, the thought of having indigenous men and women become local pastors seemed absurd to the U.S. Hispanic Mestizo leadership of the IEMB. After all, they were indigenous. But by 1965, the IEMB had begun to look for young indigenous men and women who might become pastors. They were developing plans to become autonomous from the United Methodist Church, which would allow the IEMB to develop its own, more culturally appropriate guidelines for what it takes to get ordained. For example, entering seminary shouldn't require a high school diploma. Very, very few indigenous children graduated from a high school at the time. Facing the challenges for the mission of the IEMB, they initiated an ambitious experimental project to form and train new church leaders, both lay and clergy. The Methodist Seminary John Wesley was created in the town of Montero in the state of Santa Cruz in 1966 and began the activities with 6 students under the direction of Reverend James Pace and later Reverend Roberto Caulfield, who were busy preparing classrooms and housing for the first students and teachers. Later, due to the demand for a larger number of students, and adequate infrastructure, a more functional building was built annexed to the premises of the Montero Rural Institute School. In 1966, Pastor Barber encouraged Felipe to become one of the new indigenous pastors. Felipe had attended the local school in Eucalyptus, getting through his freshman year in high school. Barber and the members of the church pushed Felipe to attend seminary in Montero right away. Felipe was only 20 years old. All of Felipe's expenses would be paid by the church, but he had to make his own way by bus to Montero, which is near to Santa Cruz and a long, long way from Eucalyptus. Family couldn't afford the bus ticket. One Sunday after worship, the pastor and a committee of persons came to him and said, quote, "We want to send you to seminary, so we gathered a small contribution to pay for your bus ticket," unquote. And then they handed him an envelope with the money inside. And Felipe said, quote, "It was a big decision, deciding whether to go or not. But since my church, my community wanted me to go, I had to go to Montero." End quote. Felipe was in the first class of indigenous candidates for the ministry, but seminary education was segregated. Most Hispanic Mestizo Methodist seminary students, mostly graduates of the American Institutes, went to Buenos Aires, Argentina for schooling. A high school diploma was required to attend that seminary. There they joined with Methodist Hispanic students from across South America, and they received a high-quality European North American style seminary education from a faculty that included several U.S. and British professors. Meanwhile, the indigenous seminary students went to the Methodist Seminary in Montero, Bolivia. But Montero didn't require a high school diploma. Felipe's story of the seminary in Montero begins with a 20-hour ride in the back of a truck. He had never been off the Altiplano, and he was fascinated as he rode through the valleys area around Cochabamba, and then stunned as he entered the upper Amazon River basin in the Beni. When Felipe arrived in Santa Cruz at about 3 o'clock in the morning, he spent the night with the other passengers in the middle of the street until dawn. With a heat that he had never experienced before and with tiredness, he fell asleep on the sidewalk for the remainder of the night. And then it began to rain. Not like the short, thin rains of the Altiplano, but the heavy downpours that happen in the Amazon. And he was miserable. Now, you need to know that Santa Cruz is a very, very Criollo-dominated town. They want nothing to do with the indigenous, whom they call by the derogatory name the Coyas. Felipe said as soon as dawn broke, he was looking around trying to figure out where he was when, to his great surprise, found some inscriptions on the wall of the streets where they said in big letters, "Make homeland killing Coyas." What? Wow. Where am I? Am I at the wrong destination? He managed to get on a bus and arrived in Montero at about 11 o'clock in the morning in the rain. When he finally arrived in the Montero Rural Institute, Methodist College, upon entering the seminary building, he was greeted by Pastor Jim Pace, the director of the seminary. And after some initial instructions, he was taken to the boys' boarding school, to the room where he would room with Zacarias Mamani, who was in his first year, and Martin Hilary, who was in his first year from the Lake District. The program of studies included the first 2 years of living in Montero and attending seminary classes in the mornings from Tuesday to Friday. In the afternoon, they had classes on practical topics such as mechanics, music, agronomy, principles of veterinary medicine, and first aid practice. This was because the IEMB saw their pastors not only doing spiritual work, but also to help improve their communities that they are working in. The third year of seminary was designated as the Year of Practice by the Central Executive Committee of the IEMB. For this year, the CEN, Central Executive Committee, not Yes, I am. And the seminary decided that my appointment for the municipal practice year would be back at my home in the Eucalyptus subdistrict. So after completing the practice year, that completed the program of studies to receive a diploma and to be eligible to be appointed as a pastor. We also had the option to receive a bachelor's degree if we completed papers on several required subjects that were approved by the professors, which he did. The seminary courses included the Bible, including general introduction, exegesis, theology of the Old and New Testaments, and there were courses on systematic theology, comparative theological currents, ethics, Christian doctrine, practical theology, such as pastoral work, Christian education and preaching, and history, the history of the Christian church, the history of Methodism, and the history of Christianity in Latin America. There were also courses on social sciences, Spanish, universal religions, philosophy, developmental psychology, pastoral psychology, sociology, community development, first aid, and library sciences. And there was participation in seminars, workshops on the national and Latin American reality. Students who failed 3 subjects during the year were not invited to continue with their studies. It was a very rigid disciplinary system that demanded punctuality, respect, cooperation, community coexistence, fulfillment of duties, and conduct. Each of these were subject to periodic and final evaluation on these issues. The teachers at the seminary were Roberto and Rosa Caulfield, LeGrand Smith Jr., Jim Jones, Jim Allais, James and Evelyn Pace, Adolfo Angles, Oscar Vargas, Harry and Patricia Peacock, Jose Carlos Diaz, Tatsuma Yamahata, Charles King, Enrique Yanez, Jaime Bravo, and Jose Mera. At the Montero Seminary, the students were taught a more basic curriculum than what was taught in Argentina. It focused more on the practical work of the pastors, and it taught a holistic approach to theology, one which focused on the whole person, not just saving souls. Seminary was quite hard, and the director seemed to be more concerned about our behavior than about our education. Another important aspect in the formation of the students was the weekend internships in worship services and church activities in churches and outposts of the Eastern District. We would receive information and recommendation about each church, and we were being sent to and regarding the characteristics of the membership and what necessary equipment each student should carry. Normally, in addition to the Bible and auxiliary materials, we would take a first aid kit and envelopes of seeds to promote family gardens. To make it easier to reach the designated places, most of the men were given a bicycle, since motorized vehicles were often unable to reach certain towns, and they must continue on bicycle to the designated place. Felipe did his internship in Puerto Fernandez colony at the La Transfiguration Methodist Church. The Puerto Fernandez colony was one of the new villages that had just popped up in the Amazon. The government was giving land to anyone who would go into the Amazon jungle and homestead the land, unquote, clear it up, turn it into a farm, and if they stayed 5 years, the land was theirs for free. So people flocked to these homesteads in the jungle, and every 10 or 20 kilometers, the government had planned to have a small community to be formed to service the farmers. Fernandez Colony was just one of those towns. Now, worship in the homesteader villages was an event of great significance for the settler families. They had left behind their place of origin and their extended families, and they now found themselves in a new place with a new and strange environment and climate. The members of these communities were made up of Aymara and Quechua people. Most of them had never lived with people from another nationality, and they didn't know how to talk to each other. They didn't even know the same language, and they had to find new ways of relating to the members of the colony. Most of all, they needed help in learning how to farm these extensive hectares of fertile and productive land, full of lush forests, to learn how to adapt to a way of life in the midst of the heat and the mosquito. and it took courage and strength of spirit to stick it out. But if they could learn how to farm in this strange new jungle environment, they would be sowing the seeds of hope for a better life for their families and the promises of the God of life. The first seminary class was made up primarily from indigenous persons and began with 25 students, but only 7 students graduated. Rogelio Guzman, Martin Hilary, Tencio Chocolo, Mario Seguiera, Freddy Cuevas, Felilpe Saucedo, and Simon Cepedez, who's Quechua, and Florencio Segovia. Don't think Annabelle Guzman was in this class. I'm not sure. And I think Annabelle is mestizo. And the others graduated 3 years later. They were accepted as national pastors at the historic First Autonomous General Assembly of 1969. Several of these pastors formed the unofficial but basically central leadership of the Aymara, who would soon push for full independence from New York. Upon graduation day, each student had to sign off on the following statement, quote, "After finishing my studies, I will not demand any salaried job by the Methodist Church," unquote. Today, it's the opposite. On the other hand, scholarship recipients sign a commitment to work in the church at the end of their studies. In November 1969, the first 7 indigenous pastors did receive appointments to serve churches, but most of the indigenous pastors got appointment to the rural areas, where almost all the church growth would come from in the next decade. Felipe was assigned to serve in the Yungas, the Altabini district, from 1970 to 71. This was a new area in the Amazon where the new homesteaders were moving to perhaps have a better way of life. Felipe's main church was the Church of Belén in San Luis, but he also had 3 small churches in outlying smaller communities and a church in Mayaya. Felipe was responsible for having worship each week in both the 2 churches and the 3 avanzadas in his area. An avanzada is where the church was trying to form a congregation, but only had a few members. You need, I think the number is 20, you need to at least have 20 persons to join the IEMB before you can become an actual IEMB church. Before that, you're a mission zone or an avanzada. The work involved the usual church activities of worship in the 2 churches and the 3 avanzadas, but it also included Pastor Felilpe becoming involved in most of the community organizations, both civic, social, and sports, as well as accompanying agricultural technicians who came to develop agricultural projects in the area. The Saucedos were greeted and welcomed when they first went to the Yungas Altabini circuit. The community found a home where they could live, and the families welcomed them with open arms. But it was still difficult because of the poverty of the area and because they were far from their own family and from other churches. It was during this time that the military dictatorship of General Hugo Banzar began. As I said in an earlier regular episode of this series, this was when the right-wing politicians and dictators had begun to be suspicious of the work of the Methodist Church in Bolivia. The IEMB was organizing and helping all of these new colonies in the jungle, and these colonies were hotbeds of democratic thought and belief, and several of the leaders of the Peasants' Union and the Miners' Union came from these colonies. As a consequence, a raid and the detention of suspects, including pastors, began in this area. The troops from a nearby military post in the area began searching for leaders of the colonies and the churches. Faced with this situation, the members of the churches and leaders, in order to protect their own personal safety, decided to go into the bush for 2 weeks. They were equipped with the respective elements of survival that are needed in the bush until the searches and the arrests ceased. After a long time had passed while they were hiding, they were informed that, yes, the military had searched the home of Pastor Felilpe, raiding the parsonage, but they found nothing. This event, along with the raids of IEMB churches and parsonages all over Bolivia, marked the moment when the IEMB's social and prophetic commitment became an important facet of their pastoral work. God was calling the IEMB to be that prophetic voice for democracy and the human and political rights of the indigenous. But the pastors and the IEMB leaders received strong support from its church members, even though it was dangerous to do so. Pastor Felilpe, along with his wife Blanca, continued their pastoral career working in several different districts. They were always in the frontiers of the Methodist Church in Bolivia, initiating new congregations, developing programs of evangelism, encouraging the formation of leaders, pastoral care and social work and health in the communities by his wife, who was a nurse. Also building chapels, pastoral houses, planning and executing development projects in the communities, and social support for projects aimed at the population and low-income families in the suburban areas. The Saucedos were very grateful to share with their Aymara, Quechua, and Spanish-speaking brothers because they have always found openness, welcome, appreciation, commitment, work, spirit of solidarity, and fundamentally the deep spirituality and ancestral values of our people and our culture. In addition, both the Aymara and the Quechua are very giving people towards the pastoral family and the ministry and development of local churches. Even now, as a retired pastor, Felipe continues to have the same rhythm and pastoral work. But we will see in the upcoming episodes how Felipe becomes one of the central figures to bring about the Aymara Revolution in the IEMB. The next episode speaks of the growing tensions between the missionaries and the Criollo pastors on one side and the indigenous pastors and the laity on the other. And those tensions finally led to an Aymara eruption, the occupation of the conference offices by the indigenous, and their demand to have proportional representation at all levels of the church. It is the story of gaining independence and autonomy from GBGM and from the Mestizo Creole Methodist elitist leaders. And it was accomplished in a way that is unlike any story I have ever heard. You're going to want to listen to that. Season 3, Episode 2. There were many sources which I drew for this episode. The book Historia de la Iglesia Evangelica Metodista en Bolivia, 1906-2006, Una Iglesia Evangelica Inculturada, by Delfín Quispe, Compilador y Investigador, 2006, was extremely helpful. And the World Gini, G-I-N-I Index, Survey Year 2002 is where I got the inequality statistics. But of course, the majority of these stories come from discussions I've had with Felipe over the last 35 years and his response to 11 written questions. These questions, his 12-page response, much of which I have quoted on this episode, are on the website if you would like to go there and see them. Go and find the S3E2 bonus episode, and you will find it there.